Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. This is Mr. Baker checking in with you all again. Just want to give you a quick little, review slash support for your test coming up. Remember, it is going to be on one day. It'll be Thursday of this week. It is going to be 10 multiple choice questions. It'll be 5 completion short responses, and then you'll have an essay question. And all of those things collectively will be 30 points, and you'll have a percentage score that will be put into the grade book. The multiple choices are worth 1.5 points each. The short response slash completion fill in the blanks are 1 point each, and then your essay is 10 points. So, what does that mean? It means that you want to be very proficient on a lot of things that are on that study guide. No specifics. Definition of imperialism would be helpful. What are causes of imperialism? Social things, cultural, political, economic, military, of course. The Spanish American War is a turning point. Very, very important. I would not worry too much about battles and things. We really did not get into that very much. But I would definitely think about the causes, short term and long term. I would be very familiar with the idea of how this war changes the dynamic of American involvement in the world, particularly with our much more hands on policy toward places like the Caribbean. How do we get more involved in the Pacific, China through the open door, and also the idea of debates on both sides. Why do certain people support a pro-imperialist approach, whereas others would support one that is more on the other side of the coin? I can assure you that the foreign policies of Roosevelt that we talked about briefly, Taft and Wilson, those are important things to think about. How do they all, in their own way, bring the country into this kind of like this identity or status, if you will, that we haven't seen, at least in the same way. If you can write about those things with depth, with some detail, with some evidence, and also analysis, then I think you should be in pretty good shape from the standpoint of imperialism. As far as World War One, I would not get too bogged down with a lot of real picky detail with European causes. I would know a little bit about how things like imperialism and nationalism and things like alliance systems kind of bring about a possibility of war. We talked very briefly about the idea of how even the rise of new countries that are going to be unified, like Germany, is probably, in my mind anyway, the best example of that. Those are going to be longer term, keep in mind, whereas short term would be something along the lines of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The primary focus, however, as far as our side of our study, if you recall, is definitely going to be the American neutrality policy through our, about a year and some change involvement in the war. I would definitely be able to show an understanding of a progression from neutrality to the events that the sinking of Lusitania, the Zimmerman Note, and how it kind of makes us definitely go in the direction of war. But more importantly, beyond that, I think two other things to me stand out the most. How does America go through a process of mobilization? There's certain ways to look at that. You could say when we think of mobilize, we think of movement, which is certainly true. How do we get our forces across the Atlantic Ocean to be able to make a military contribution? The importance of John J. Pershing as a famous general, the American Expeditionary Forces. But very, very important for you to really be able to write about and think about with primary sources, possible visual questions, is those three big areas of impact. How does this affect the home front? I like to refer to this as the way that we keep the home fires burning so that we have a society for the soldiers to come back and actually be able to have something to come back to. So social things, how do women make a contribution through their work in defense factories? How do African Americans move in fairly decent sized numbers from especially southern states where they're enduring segregation and of course a lot of the outcomes of the reconstruction that we talked about last quarter, and they're moving into northern states, particularly cities like Chicago, New York City, Boston, as they would say, places like that are more industrial. They have jobs. Detroit, Michigan, Catch that, guys. Anyway, those kinds of places that actually are going to have more defense jobs. And that's an important thing for those two groups. The downside, as far as social things, and this becomes political as well, is going to be some of the negative effects toward the immigrant population. Um, how do people that are from, like Germany, Austria, Hungary, places like that are on the opposite side of America's support, and then also eventually our alliance system. Um, you're going to see a rise of nativism. You're going to see more Ku Klux Klan activity that's not only somewhat targeting the African American population, but is also targeting a lot of the immigrants, for a variety of reasons. Part of it is cultural. You see, as we move into the Roaring Twenties, a greater focus on prohibition. And so people like the Irish that were more sympathetic to the Central Powers are going to be targeted for those reasons. The other side of the coin with economics, this becomes, how does our government kind of transition us from a state of peace to a time of war? Some historians refer to this as a process that we call conversion. This is kind of a big deal. You're talking about taking the United States and the world in particular, but particularly us, from a state of more consumer-based economic productivity to one that's more defense-oriented. And that takes some time. It takes some planning, and that's going to be the job of the War Industries Board through Bernard Baruch. He's a name that you don't come across as often as you would like a Herbert Hoover becomes a future president. But those men, Herbert Hoover with the Food Administration, George Creel with the Committee on Public Information with Propaganda, they all have a role with encouraging people to kind of be, I guess, what I would call sacrificing, whether it's food, whether it's a resource. It could be like metals, it could be oil, gasoline, and that's a big deal. How do we transition us to funding a war? Whether it's higher taxes or in the case of war bonds, kind of like the government saying, here's an IOU that we'll pay you back later. And then last but not least, the political side. We talked about Wilson's leadership, which we'll come back to in a moment, but the big picture with Wilson, keep in mind, is definitely going to be that he kind of sets the tone for American involvement when he makes the famous statement, make the world safe for democracy. That's kind of a big deal if you think about it, because that kind of is very, not identical, but similar to his peace without victory slogan that he's very big on with Versailles. Doesn't really get his way with that, but he does make his attempt there. And then you've got, like I said, the nativism policies later on that lead to the first Red Scare that we'll look at a little bit starting tomorrow with the political side of the Roaring Twenties. But the big thing outside of that is definitely going to be this Versailles Treaty. I apologize I'm not there to be with you from yesterday to really address it with you. But just keep in mind the leadership of Wilson. How does his 14 points, self-determination, the idea of the League of Nations, the idea of trying to allow for the freedom of the seas, less punishment to Germany, etc. That is not really going to be something that he gets, but when he brings to the treaty back, keep in mind, he's got opposition. If you watched my video yesterday, then you know the basic nuts and bolts of that. Okay, so those are going to be themes as you think about studying, as you think about reading, things that we've done, reviewing your homeworks, content, etc., that you really want to not just understand it, but you also want to be able to write about it with a purpose. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I will see you hopefully later this week sometime, and hope you all are doing well. See you guys.